We are going to continue on the First Seminole War from the documents. Most all these documents that I'm going to be getting the information from are from letters to the Secretary of War. Last time we had some Indian Affairs papers, not so much in this batch. This is going to be dealing with January 1818, events leading up to the Seminole War. So let me get my screen share. Okay. Okay. January 1818. Now, to refresh your memory real quick on some of the events leading up to this, the Seminole Indians, in retaliation for the Americans attacking Fowltown, a week later, they attacked a supply boat on the Apalachicola River led by Lieutenant Scott, known as the Scott Massacre, killed nearly everybody on board, about 37 soldiers or so. There's estimated about 6 women. One would actually become prisoner and be taken to Econfina town. That was Elizabeth Stewart, and she will be freed a couple months later. And we'll talk about that when we get close to that time. And there may have been some children killed on the boat. So that pretty much touches off the First Seminole War in full fury. We had other incidents earlier, the destruction of Bainstown on Alachua Prairie, the destruction of Negro Fort or Prospect Bluff, and then after that, things seemed to settle down for a few months. Now the Seminoles have attacked an Army target, so the Army's getting involved, and this is where Andrew Jackson starts to get involved. Meanwhile, at Fort Scott, General Gaines receives orders to go to Fernandina, Amelia Island, and take care of some pirates there. But most of what we're talking about tonight's all taking place in Georgia. Here's a map of Georgia. Let's go to southern Georgia. And we'll be talking about these places probably. First of all, Fort Hawkins up near Macon. That is the Indian agency established by Benjamin Hawkins a few years earlier. Benjamin Hawkins dies in 1816, and the next year the president appoints David Mitchell as Indian agent to the Creeks. More about that later. Then heading on a road, there's a road called Blackshear Trail that was made by Colonel Blackshear during the War of 1812. A few years earlier, it goes to Hartford. Hartford's main settlement in Georgia at the time, maybe might even be a territorial capital or something, or the short-lived state capital. It's now a ghost town. It's near Hawkinsville, Georgia. The road continues to what we have Fort Early, southwest of there. And there's also, to the west of that, there's an area called Blackshear's breastworks or defenses. From there, the soldiers would either go down the Flint River, southwest to Fort Scott, but I don't know if that's all navigable. And if they're marching, they'd usually go directly west to Fort Gaines there on the Chattahoochee, and then the Chattahoochee, they can go down to Fort Scott from there. There are some rocks and rapids on the Chattahoochee further north around Columbus. Between Fort Early and Fort Gaines, you have 2 creek settlements, the Chehaw Indians or the Chehaw settlement and Old Harrods. Chehaw, both of these are friendly to the United States and will support Andrew Jackson. Tragedy on the Chehaw settlement we'll talk about later. Old Harrods, there's a historical marker out there. Now, General Gaines, he was received orders to go to Point Peter. Now, he can't go straight across because there's no roads. He has to go back up the same way they just came, up to Fort Gaines, to Fort Early, to Hartford. Once around Hartford or Fort Hawkins, he can go to Savannah and then catch a ship down to Fort Peter. Fort Peter is one of the most uh, important naval ports at the time because it's on the international border with Spain. This is a major naval base at the time at St. Mary's. That's the furthest south naval base on the East Coast the United States have. Now, all the area south of Fort Gaines and Fort Early was land that was Creek land that was ceded to the United States. The Creeks were forced to give that up in the Treaty of Fort Jackson in August 1814, so 3.5 years earlier. There's still Creek land in Georgia, Creek Reservation, and that will be taken away from the Creeks over the next 20 years. One with the Treaty of Indian Springs. Chief William McIntosh will give that away, and the Creek Council will have him killed because of that. Now you have Neomathil and Fowltown on the Fowl River, just a few miles from Fort Scott. And they were not part of the Treaty of Fort Jackson, and they were not really involved much in the Creek War, so they don't consider the treaty having any effect on them. So General Gaines wants to talk to them, but Neomathil says, I have nothing to say to you there. So that's the area we're talking about in this video. Now, all these places have historical markers and monuments. They're mostly forgotten. There's these granite boulder monuments. They're put up by the Daughters of the American Revolution, early 1900s, 1916 or 1930s. A lot of those are actually on private property, which is kind of strange. Like Fort Early, there's a big granite boulder. It's in somebody's driveway. I looked on Google Maps, and I guess that's awful strange that if you want to see the monument to Fort Early, there's a house right behind it. So anyway, we'll start on January 1st, 1818. And so Colonel James Bankhead, he's gone down to Fernandina, Amelia Island, sends a message to General Ory from the ship U.S. ship John Adams, Fernandina, reassuring that forces are there under orders from the government. So he's reassuring the Spanish that they do have permission from the government to be there. Colonel Bankhead sends a letter to John C. Calhoun, Secretary of War from Fernandina, Amelia Island. So he's enclosing a letter from Governor Coppinger with the best translation he's been able to obtain. Seems like one of the people Bankhead's with is Joseph Hernandez, who will later on be a brigadier general in the Florida militia during the Second Seminole War. Hernandez and Bankhead are together at Fernandina, and they reply to the Spanish governor, Joseph Coppinger, saying, we have received your communication, and I can inform you that possession and occupation of this place by the forces of the United States under our command has been in obedience to our government. The irony here is that a couple months later, General Jackson will claim the same authority to take St. Mark's and Pensacola in the middle Florida, western Florida, but he's going to cause a lot of controversy there. Nobody remembers the Americans capturing Fernandina and Amelia Island. Okay, on January 9th, 1818, or actually before that, January 7th, from the Hermitage, General Jackson's adjutant writes to General Parker. The adjutant is James Glassell. He'll eventually, as captain, he will be the one who establishes Fort King a few years later. He's writing from Nashville, said that, the Congressional Honor or the Congressional Medal that Jackson's being that's being struck in Jackson's honor. He says it looks pretty good, but there's a word totally unintelligible that they couldn't understand. And they say, what is this word? Eventually, the government will write back and said that word that you don't understand, that is, hold on. So next page here. The word you do not understand is Anita Chapco, the Battle of Anita Chapco, or that means Long Thicket. That was one of the crucial battles that Jackson fought before the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. So I guess they're making a medal in commemoration of Jackson's Creek campaign. I've never seen what that looked like. I don't know if they scrapped that design and just went with this one here commemorating Jackson's victory at the Battle of New Orleans on January 8th. And, one more thing is that Glassell writes, I think that if we have a Spanish war, go to war with Spain, particularly if my old chief, he's talking about Jackson, visits General Gaines's command while they're engaged with the Indians. In that event, rest assured that neither Pensacola nor St. Augustine would be a protection to them, provided our forces was competent to the reduction of those places. So here you have, coming from Jackson's headquarters, saying that they're going to go after the Indians in Florida, and if they go to take shelter in Pensacola or St. Augustine, Jackson will not hesitate to destroy those places. So he's sending out his intentions right here. What Jackson's going to do the next few months is going to be no surprise to anyone. General Gaines writes to the Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, from Hartford, Georgia. He says that Colonel Arbuckle and Major Muhlenberg have been cut off from supplies by the principal force of the enemy on the Apalachicola, believed to be 800 to 1,200 strong. We have plans for sending for supplies and rations. They're working on a road by General Glasscock, 60 miles from the Cheehaw village to Fort Scott. Construction of ball-proof boats, that's boats that can deflect musket balls. Indians killed a woman near Trader's Hill and took off with 4 Negroes. A detachment of artillery from Amelia Island and 2 companies of General Floyd's militia are going to Trader's Hill, which is near St. Mary's. Rain has delayed General Glasscock's troops, and their service may expire. General Gaines is in need of permanent full-time quartermaster. He also needs more funds for the Georgia militia at Fort Hawkins and Fort Scott. The weather is actually creating problems for the Army. A lot of rain, a lot of cold weather, and this is result from the explosion of the volcano a couple years earlier, Mount Tambora, which exploded and threw ash up into the atmosphere and created the year without summer, what they called it, led to the partially defeat of Napoleon's army at Waterloo. It's still having effects on the earth 2 years later, and it will continue to cause cold weather and serious drought all over the world for the next few years. Here's Brigadier General Thomas Glasscock. His father was famous in the Revolutionary War. Junior here is commanding the Georgia militia. He says the command's 4 miles from Fort Blackshear, waiting for the river to fall so they can repair the roads. So I think that's near Fort Early. He says much of the friendly Indian property was taken by the Foultown Indians, and provisions can be procured from the friendly Indians, the Cheehaws. What he's talking is about when the Army first left Fort Scott. They left Chief Kennard, or I'm sorry, one of the Perryman brothers, Creek Chief, in charge as a caretaker at Fort Scott. The Foultown Indians came over and ransacked the place and burned his house and chased him away. January 12th, 1818, Colonel Arbuckle at Fort Scott writes to General Jackson at the Hermitage in Nashville. He says he's received the resignation of Lieutenant Sharp due to his intemperate habits and his conduct in a skirmish with Indians. Yeah, I'd like to get more information on that. On the 4th, I crossed the Flint River and found Foultown deserted and burned it. So the Army returns for a third time to Foultown, finds it deserted, and they burn it to the ground. I went to Attapulgis and found it abandoned and the cattle and stock removed. That's a nearby Indian town to the east, Attapulgis. Actually, I go by that area, visit some friends quite often. It says the Attapulgis Indians have gone beyond the Occoquan River and have considerable intercourse with Indians on the Chattahoochee, many of whom assisted with the destruction of Lieutenant Scott and his party and attacked the vessels under Major Muhlenberg. So the Attapulgis Indians have joined the Seminoles and most likely fled to Miccosukee Town. The Creeks, or I guess he's saying about the Seminoles, the Miccosukees, view the Americans as the aggressors. Well, of course they are, because they're the ones who attacked Foultown initially. Any war will be a short duration. The forces here are too small and no information on the Georgia militia or Chief McIntosh's Indians. We only have 2 days meat rations and 30 days flour on hand. Captain Birch at Fort Gaines for the purpose of selling beef. If the agent persists in neglecting duties, it'll be disastrous. The Army's having supply problems. The agent who received the beef sold it and pocketed the money there. More on that. Captain Cummings is sent to the bay. He's talking about Appalachia Bay, where the Apalachicola River goes out into the Gulf of Mexico, for obtaining information of vessels with provisions. And a sergeant and 4 mountain men on express to Fort Hawkins have not been heard from. P.S. The contractor agent has failed, and the militia that are 90 miles above badly supplied. Captain Birch has obtained 30 head of beef cattle at Fort Gaines, compelled to take them as the people refused to sell. So the Army took by force the cattle owned by the settlers at Fort Gaines. July 12th, General Gaines to John C. Calhoun, Secretary of War, from Hartford. Gaines is writing from Hartford and says the slow movement of the militia will not meet up with regulars at Fort Scott due to the weather. Gaines has no confidence in the reliability of the friendly Indians. There is illegal smuggling of Negroes from East Florida to the Creek Agency. Victims of savage cruelty are charged with being intruders on public land. That means refugees who've been attacked, their homesteads have been attacked by the Indians. They're crowding around Fort Gaines. Now, General Gaines says something that's very important here. He uncovers an illegal African slave smuggling operation. What it is the Indian agent David Mitchell is smuggling African slaves, and he's in the business with Chief William McIntosh. They're bringing them in from Amelia Island through Spanish Florida and up to the Creek Agency. This will eventually cause David Mitchell to be removed from his post by the president. He was appointed by the president a year earlier. The president's going to have to be the one to remove him after a congressional investigation, and that will take place a couple years after this. It takes a while to have a congressional investigation. Colonel Arbuckle at Fort Scott to Gaines says nothing of the militia has shown up except they are 25 miles from the Flint River. The contractor has failed to provide provisions. Captain Birch succeeded in procuring 30 or 40 heads of beef cattle. Our horses have distemper, which I fear will destroy a great many of them. So not only is the Army starving, it's having to put down its horses because of distemper. January 18th, Arbuckle to General Glasscock says the hostile Indians are to meet on the 21st concerning measures to the destruction of the inhabitants on the Chattahoochee and the destruction of this post in 5 or 6 days. But he doesn't believe it. He says one vessel has arrived in the bay with clothing and military stores, but very little provisions. So they're still starving. And they will be starving for a few weeks after this. General Gaines writes to Benjamin Orr at Fort Hawkins, ordering army rations for the army and Georgia militia to Fort Scott and the Chehaw village, repaying the Chehaws for the rations they have provided the army. James Gadsden on Andrew Jackson's staff in Nashville at the Hermitage writes to John C. Calhoun, says that General Jackson has ordered the funds and supplies from the quartermaster, as well as used his own funds to supply the army. Next, we have this historical marker. I think it's west of Fort Early near Dawson. You can look up a website there that says where Georgia historical markers are. The Black Shear Trail that I mentioned earlier, built during the War of 1812. This is the trail that General Jackson's going to come down to Fort Gaines and then to Fort Scott. It mentions a skirmish on here, one that we don't know much about. Not quite sure where it is, but it was in this area. It says at Cedar Creek. It says, I was ordered by General Glasscock to take 5 men and meet Captain Lee with provisions from Hartford, proceeding to the Black Shear Works, I guess the breastwork that was built on the creek by Black Shear when he built the road. We reached the creek while Captain Lee and Private Sam Loftus were crossing. They were fired upon by a party of Indians, supposed to be 20 or 30. Both were shot dead. So the captain and the private are killed crossing the river. With Isaac Brown's command, we took shelter on a corner of Black Shear's old works. The Indians were planted in the swamp at least 100 yards. Having not more than 27 men, we proceeded down the creek to make the way across to the army. We reached the works commanded by Major Morgan. We requested to detach a portion of the command for the protection of Fort Gaines. And it says on here, the Battle of Skin Cypress Ponds, which is, I guess, another name for the battle fought on the Black Shear Trail. During this battle, 3 soldiers were killed and another number of Indians killed. They are buried on the site of the battle in unmarked graves. So somewhere in this area. Interesting, because I don't have this battle listed in my publications. So, I'm always finding out something new. 22nd January, same day, General Gaines writes to Captain Callis from Hartford. Gaines is not too far away in Hartford, Georgia. He chastises Callis for not supplying rations and the pork as he said he would. Brigadier General Glasscock has spent $2,000 of his own money to supply rations for the troops. Gaines said that if Callis cannot meet his requirement, then his contract will be ended. He'll be fired as a subsistence quartermaster for the Army. Gaines writes to John C. Calhoun, forwarding a report from Colonel Arbuckle and General Glasscock. There is no prospect of peace with Indians. Movement from Fort Scott has been delayed until General Jackson arrives. So they're anticipating Jackson to come down, which he'll start to come down the next month. John C. Calhoun writes to David Mitchell. David Mitchell, he's a former governor of Georgia. He resigned and then he was appointed the Creek Indian agent in 1817. And as I mentioned, he's running an illegal racket, a slave racket, and doing some other things that we might mention later on. Calhoun says the president liked your efforts at trying to make peace, but the application of force in the adjustment of our Indians must be made before we can indulge well-grounded hopes of a durable peace. Calhoun's telling Mitchell, it's go and be the rod for right now. That, they're done talking peace. Captain Callis from Hartford writes to General Gaines, says that the rations were delivered with a cost overrun to Fort Hawkins, Fort Mitchell, and Fort Gaines, that the contractor at Fort Hawkins, Mr. Lafarkey, has sold these rations without his knowledge. So the trader received them at Fort Hawkins. Instead of giving them to the Army, he went ahead and sold them. Captain Callis to Fort Gaines, a receipt from Callis stating that the rations from him ordered by Gaines were sent and delivered to Fort Hawkins and sold. Okay. Back to Hartford. Major Wright of the Georgia militia at Hartford to General Gaines. Major Wright proceeded to Savannah, where he found that Lieutenant Colonel Marshall, that a draft had been made, but there has been a large number of desertions, and 47 have exempt themselves. So they're trying to raise soldiers for the Georgia militia. Under federal law, they can only raise the soldiers for 90 days, 3 months, and that's it. But he's not finding any volunteers. The regiment has been reduced to 1/2 and can't be met without violation of the civil law, and that the men have refused to go immediately. In order to compose the regiment, they have to have so many number of men. If they can't meet that, they're not able to form the regiment, and that's also by law. The settlers are afraid of the Creeks attacking their homesteads. They're not wanting to leave there to go down to Fort Scott. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison says that some days before they can leave their homes, a second draft will be necessary to fill the ranks. Colonel Marshall since reports that a second draft has been made. Getting near the end of the month, January 29th, General Jackson, or Calhoun to Jackson. It's hoped that the measures you have taken will bring a speedy end to the war. All supplies will be provided. Regret that there is not proper topographical maps to be supplied. So Jackson's getting the blessing of the Secretary of War. Gaines writes on January 30th to John C. Calhoun. Gaines has endeavored to inform himself of the country between the Apalachicola River and the St. Johns River. A description of the country between Alachua Town and St. Mark's, and which areas have pine barrens, need roads, required boats and fording. So Gaines right now is planning to occupy Florida and take it from the Spanish. He wouldn't be writing down this information if he wasn't there. He believes the Army can march with a few wagons down the Apalachicola to the St. John's and Amelia Island or to Swanee in a short time without difficulty, carrying their own provisions. Major Bankhead reports that 2,000 Spanish troops have arrived to St. Augustine, but the report is to be doubted, and he's right on that. The Spanish have not received any troops. And what he's talking about doing here is the exact same thing that Jackson will do in the following March. Indians have attacked and killed a settler on Trader's Hill. Georgia militia returns are being sent with this letter. Regret to say that cooperation with the volunteers has failed, and they have not been able to muster enough provisions or enough troops. Quartermaster provisions are on the way of Fort Scott by the way of the Flint River, and over expense. They overpaid. And that pretty much covers January 1818. That is it for this video, and the next we'll continue in February when General Jackson starts marching down from Tennessee. And I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll come by later. Okay.